Welcome to Season 2 of FinTech's a podcast by the one and only policy shop for Canada's fintech scene. I'm Alex, and I'll be your host. Join me as I talk to the people who are making a big difference in the lives of Canadians. Today, we're talking to Sue Whitney. When it comes to payments, Sue's seen it all. She's worked for the government in payments policy. She's worked for just about every major payment system operator in the country. Now she leads payment strategy and relationships at Central One. Sue, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
So look, you've worked at some of the most important payment systems in this country, Interac, Visa, Payments Canada. One thing I've always wondered, but I've never been able to get a straight answer about, is do these systems all compete with each other?
So yeah, all the payment networks, so Visa, MasterCard, Interac, Discover, all of them are developed with one clear mission, which is maximize volume. That's how they get paid, and it's also how they deliver value and reinforce their brand. Payments Canada is a little different. It's core infrastructure, so it's not the same. But when you step back 10,000 feet, everyone is vying for the usage of a payment method by a Canadian, because that's how they deliver value. So in that sense, they compete. But I think most of the networks also understand that it's critical that all Canadians have access to multiple choices. So I don't think anybody's out there seeking monopoly rights. That's not the way they play. What I would say is networks that are very commercially oriented have financial imperatives, which tends to influence your day-to-day life. So when I worked at Visa, it was extremely important for us to be driving innovation, new product capabilities that would maximize usage of VisaNet. And I know my MasterCard colleagues were the same, because of the realities of the financial imperatives, and much less so for Payments Canada, which is really, a place that drives making sure that you're meeting public policy objectives and delivering infrastructure for the country. So the mandates are different. In a sense, they're all competing for a transaction. And so in that way, they do compete, which is really good for Canada, right? Because it helps drive innovation. It helps drive differentiation, and in the same way that financial institutions compete, and
Right.
fintechs for that matter.
So depending on who I talk to, I always hear different things. I've heard loud and clear that these networks compete, and they do. I mean, if you look at all the different payment methods, there appear to be a bunch. However, some say, well, the market's very concentrated. The use of certain payment instruments often does exceed the use of others. So my question for you, I guess, is like, how substitutable really are these different payment instruments? For example, like, is a debit card really substitutable for a credit card or not really? Or
I
an
have a couple.
EFT versus an e-transfer?
Yeah, I got a couple of good stories here. So when I started to work at Visa, my job was to introduce solutions that allowed Canadians to pay with their debit card online and when they travel, because that's the norm everywhere else in the world. And there was this strong sense amongst everybody else at Visa that it made no sense, because Canadians love their credit cards and they love their loyalty points, and there would never be any usage of a Visa debit. And it took us 7 years to convince Canada that this was a worthy product. And there is absolutely strong preferences by some Canadians. They're wired to prefer debit. And many of them are new Canadians who have challenges getting a credit card, but many of them are also young people who like to live within their means, or other people who've kind of blown it using credit card in the past and like to use this as a constraint on their payment behaviors. And so in the card space, there are some assumptions that we all travel with. And I can say, from having watched the birth of branded debit, which is what Visa and MasterCard call Visa debit and MasterCard debit, that nobody thought that Canadians would ever adopt a debit card for e-commerce. And nobody at the time was even that sure that people would want to risk exposing their bank account to online shopping. Like, that was considered to be scary. And what we saw was Canadians adopted it with alacrity. And so in payments, we always tend to assume that what we have is enough. And most Canadians do too, because they don't know that their needs aren't being met. But yet, if you think about AFT and cards, there are certain purposes for a batch payment, like payroll, that are they're fit for purpose. And so, waiting a couple of days for the payment to actually execute and having it sit in somebody's account somewhere while you're waiting, it's crazy. But it's very suitable for certain types of payments. And so, what I'm hoping we're getting as we start to do real-time rail, other innovation at Payments Canada, is greater choices. Because I think we've all got these assumptions that we're well served in Canada. I know from having traveled a lot in my payments life that we are not well served. There is opportunity for much greater innovation, much greater choice. We still have this ridiculous reliance on checks. There are pockets of places where, until COVID, we had a crazy reliance on cash. And so, actually, COVID's a great example of how you got substitutability that you never thought you'd have. But we walk with our feet and we pay the way we can. And if we remove friction and provide ease in how people move money, then there's great opportunity for substitution, for innovation. And sometimes it's innovations we don't even know we need until we see an opportunity to do things differently.
Right. You mentioned the RTR. Do you think when that thing comes online, does it give the more dominant ways to pay today a run for their money, or not really?
Um, to me, the great sacred truth of Canada is people love their cards. And they're very loyal to their cards, and their cards are loyal to them in the form of points. And unsticking um, current payment behaviors is very difficult. Online banking. I pay my bills through online banking once a month. It's my behavior. It's how I do it. Will I change how I pay my bills? Not if it's a biller who's already registered and it works every month. But if something comes along that makes it easier for me to pay a bill with a merchant I deal with less frequently, or a new relationship I'm establishing, it's prime for disruption. Real-time rail will have use cases where the immediate and final movement of money is essential. And that, to me, is the great crime in Canada right now. The only final and irrevocable payment costs a huge amount of money to send. It's a wire. And that's very difficult to access for average Canadians. You can't go into online banking and send a wire, right?
Yeah.
You got to go talk to somebody to get it done. And so there's friction all over the place for final and irrevocable payment that we will remove with the RTR. So from a consumer's point of view, I think there are a lot of use cases where that finality and instantaneous funds movement will make a difference. But and I also think that there will be some cannibalization of existing payment types. And we overvalue wires, one might argue, because it's the only final irrevocable choice. And if you look at Canadians' average wire transaction size, it's under $20,000. So it's quite ripe to be cannibalized by the real-time rail. Other payments, though, the instantaneous nature is well served by the promise of e-transfer. And the funds don't move instantaneously, but we all think they do. And I think a lot of use cases that are well served by e-transfer today, they're not going to change. You're not going to modify your behaviors for stuff that's working.
Right.
So there will be some change, I don't think it will be massive, and I think it'll take some time because it's going to be each of us identifying use cases where what we have isn't as good as what we could have. And RTR could start to deliver those what we could have, especially if people invest in innovation around the edges of it.
Right.
That remains to be seen. It's an ecosystem play. It shouldn't just be a rail.
Right. We digressed to the future for a moment. I want to take us back down memory lane. You mentioned Visa debit. So I'm just imagining your average Canadian using their debit card.
Mhm.
They can't use it online. Visa debit comes around. Now they can. They might not totally understand the significance of this or the differences between Visa debit and regular debit. Why was this not possible before Visa debit came onto the scene? And like, how exactly is Visa debit different from debit?
Great question. So in every other country around the world, a MasterCard and a Visa for the consumer, it doesn't matter if it's credit or debit. So you know how in Canada, when you're at a point of sale and the grocery store says, is that credit or debit that you're using? We're the only country in the world that ever asks that. And that's because our debit point of sale solution is a domestic only solution. And the point of sale device is wired differently to support domestic debit. In countries where you have both um, debit and credit um, offered for point of sale, nobody cares if it's a debit card or a credit card. It's just a Visa card. And there's magic that happens in the background to make sure it routes to your bank account versus to the line, the credit um, facility that you have. But the consumer doesn't care or know. So our challenge in looking at the introduction of expansion of enhancements to Canadian debit was to acknowledge debit at point of sale was really well served by Interac. And but e-commerce is the next big thing, or you know, basically hidden payments, just account on file payments where your deposit account is the source of funds, and you can register your debit card as the source of funds for Airbnb or for Uber. Um, Not possible in a point of sale only environment. And so for us, looking into the future, we thought Canadians needed a way to use their deposit account in the same way they used their credit line to facilitate money movement. And so that's what drove us to say, how do we recognize Interac where it's playing strongly and then share that card, which is not an Interac card, it's a bank card, and share that bank card by having Interac support the debit at point of sale and having Visa fill the gaps where Interac wasn't playing, which was e-commerce and cross-border.
Right.
And so that's what we built, and the banks agreed with us that they wanted a solution on a single card that offered the same functionality as an American or a Brit or Australian could have to be able to pay the way they want.
To what extent is the competitive activity of these different payment systems, to what extent is their ability to compete with each other constrained by the risk appetites and decisions of Canada's financial institutions?
Um, well, I think we should all hope that our activities as consumers are well managed from a risk point of view. And the top of mind, of course, right now, especially, is fraud. Um, and so let's think about the various risks that we're talking about here. And I expect my financial institution to send me alert um, and tell me if something smells funny and to put a hold on my account if it smells really funny, right? I demand that. Um, and so, but on the other hand, I can see scenarios where, for example, one of my financial institutions, they're a little bit too trigger happy on holding. And they also, I don't know about you, but on Saturdays, sometimes I spend more than I should on my debit card and I get close to my daily limit. And my daily limit is set quite low for one of my financial institutions. And it gets in the way and it forces me to use my credit card, which I don't like to do. I'm a debit aficionado. Um, but so it depends on the risk, right? And in the world of AML risk and some of the unfortunate things we're seeing in the money laundering space and the nefarious activities that money laundering finances, and in the world of fraud, I expect great risk management, and I expect them always to up their game. When it comes to liquidity risk and credit risk, um, those are individual decisions based on how much you know about the person you're providing risk services for, right? And we do this all the time. We have a very diverse clientele. We have a lot of credit unions, but we have other institutions as well. And so we've had to put a microscope on how do we do risk management when you're looking at institutions that have different characteristics, and, do you require more collateral, for example, to be parked for certain types of institutions compared to others? And what's your criteria for deciding that? And even more important, how do you monitor it to make sure you can loosen it or you should tighten it? So to me, really good risk management is about being dynamic. It's about making sure that you've found that right balance point between protection of the institution, of the client, of the Canadian, but at the same time, facilitating growth and innovation and doing things differently. And we're still all working on finding those balance points. I'm convinced we don't have it right, and we'll probably have to keep looking at that every single day, especially in a period like this where we're dynamic. We're looking at new things like how much money are we going to set aside on a Friday night before a long weekend for real-time rail transactions? None of us knows because we don't know what the behaviors are going to be like. So there's a balancing act that we need to all do. I don't personally view structural impediments to to people innovating in the risk space. I think that's where competition comes in, is if we're all prepared to look at things with fresh eyes, we might be able to relax things in certain situations because we've done our homework, or we've built confidence with a new partner that we can relax some of our going in perceptions as we learn more and more about each other. So I'm hoping that's the way the world's going to go.
From a consumer's perspective, whether it's Visa debit or debit, it feels the same.
Yeah.
Is the economic model for issuers and networks and the acquirers the same, whether it's Visa debit or debit, or
No,
is there a difference?
there is a big difference. And that's because the services and the functionality that's being provided are different businesses, right? Like debit at point of sale is a fairly standard offering. There's the risks associated with a point of sale transaction and an e-commerce transaction are very different, as is an international transaction. The costs of enabling those payment types is very different. So, if you've built a global network and you've got fraud checks and liquidity monitoring and 724 always on capabilities and a zero liability promise, your economic model is different than if it is as a sort of a debit point of sale model. So the business models are developed with one thing in mind, but I started with, how do I build a business model that will maximize volume for the network? And so if you need to protect issuers in certain instances, or you need to protect merchants in other instances, you need to ensure that the economic levers that you're building to it are driving maximization of volume. And that's all it is. Like, to me, networks is one sentence. How do I drive more volume?
Why don't you think the likes of Visa, MasterCard, why haven't they tried to not only occupy that online debit payment space, but just take every debit card transaction in this country? Or is there nothing stopping them? Interact does it so well, uh, they can't get in even if they tried.
So I can't speculate about Visa today. I haven't talked to them or been them for years. Um, and I have no idea what anybody else's business strategy is. What what I think is, um, networks invest where they believe there's unmet needs and where they can maximize value to drive volume. And so if there's an area of commerce that's being very well served, it might be less attractive as an investment compared to other areas where it's more obvious that there's a need. So I assume that that's what drives rational decisions of all the networks now is, you know, how can I serve Canadians better and attract more volume?
Right. The the credit card networks have been, I think, mostly silent supporters of fintech innovation in Canada with their prepaid offerings and by letting fintechs issue credit cards. I'm surprised they're not louder about that. Would you agree with the statement that the credit card networks have been the biggest supporters of fintech innovation in Canada, and why or why not?
Well, I'd call the credit card companies fintechs myself. And I would again come back to the motivator of the networks is volume. And um, if there are fintechs out there building great experiences that can help the networks attract volume or increase usage, then there's a compatibility business model there. The other thing I'll call to attention is um, the credit card networks. They got into prepaid on the recognition that um, credit and debit were um, two legs of the stool, and the third leg was a pre-funded model. What happened is, I think, the market informed the networks that there were unmet needs related to accounts, and that other than, you know, traditional financial institutions could offer um, accounts and payments capabilities that were not within the traditional realm. And to me, prepaid um, it still is, I think, a very exciting product that can facilitate innovation and expand who can issue cards and how new financial services can be delivered. So to me, it's not like credit or debit, it's a platform play, and it creates all kinds of opportunity. I can remember when I was at Visa, we looked at the American model of prepaid, and prepaid in the US is really about alternatives to bank accounts because there are many unbanked Americans. That is not the case in Canada. There's not nearly the same number of people who don't have a bank account. So where prepaid fit in Canada was really in the less traditional spaces. It was around complementing what was offered as traditional debit or credit. So a youth spending card, a cross-border multi-currency card, a small business payment card. These were all areas where the the model of the credit card model is expensive and it's big, it's heavy. Prepaid model can be lighter. There ended up being a whole value chain of suppliers who helped enable prepaid cards. So in that way, I do think the credit card networks and prepaid in particular have been catalysts of innovation and kind of broke the mold a bit because everybody assumed credit and debit was all you'd need, especially in a well-banked country like Canada. So I'm so delighted that prepaid has established the foothold it has, because that was very much in doubt when we started moving it out. The other thing I'll say is um, Visa and MasterCard are 10 years ahead of any of the rest of us in understanding usage patterns and understanding gaps and seeing where growth opportunities were. So way ahead of anybody else in understanding the power of data and using the power of data to help define business strategy and inform areas of unmet need. And again, the sole reason for being driving network volume, it helped identify use cases and prepaid as a potential tool that could unlock some use cases that weren't being well unlocked by credit and debit. So I think there was a self-serving aspect to this completely for Visa and MasterCard to drive more volume, but there was also a sense that the card space didn't need to be thought about so literally as the card space anymore. That really all cards are plastic manifestations of an account, of a source of funds. And so prepaid helped with that leap about thinking of card as simply token and source of funds. And that's, I think, really unlocked a lot of fantastic innovation and really helped merchants
Right.
reduce friction in the experiences that they have with customers.
Ultimately, self-serving though it may be, it was Adam Smith who said, it's not the benevolence of the butcher or the baker. In a competitive market, our selfishness can lead to good outcomes, pro social ones. Um, some of what you said in that last answer might lend itself to this next question, which I'm just going to call a fun one. If you had to reduce each of the payment system operators you worked at, Interac, Visa, and Payments Canada, to a bumper sticker, what would that bumper sticker say?
That's a hard question. I might like more time to think of an answer.
Take your time.
um, hmm. I honestly don't know if I can answer that question because they're all they're all they're all good at what they do.
All the PR folks at these places are frustrated now because they're waiting for their next ad campaign. You're going to give it to them with
Yeah,
this bumper
yeah.
sticker.
So I'm so not gonna do the slogans I see on TV for the little yellow truck or the Olympics commercials from Visa or um, you know, soccer commercials for MasterCard or any of that stuff. I'm not going there. Um, I don't know, for all of them, like I see them all just as part of a spectrum, and that the best thing about it is we got choice. And
Yes.
so if each of them has their way of showing choice, then the consumer's king. And that's, to me, that's what matters the most, is that
Okay.
we get to pick.
Let me try to frame it differently. We talked about how the networks are similar, that high order principle of, just driving volume.
Yep.
In what ways are they different?
So I can go back to a conversation I remember when I worked at Interac. The difference could not have been more stark. We were a domestic network, uh, just coming out of a contentious period where regulators were concerned about the business model and wanting to understand it better. Um, and uh, chip cards loomed large. And chip cards are based on a global standard. And I was responsible for helping Interac figure out how to do chip cards. And never was it ever more obvious to me than then that Interac was a domestic competitor of Visa and MasterCard, but a small player. And one with limited resources that leaned very heavily on financial institutions for expertise and funding. And so um, there were a lot of existential conversations about what was it going to take for Interac and the banks to be able to create a domestic chip card, and how was that going to occur? And uh, one of the most gratifying moments for me ever in payments was the day that Visa crossed the floor, if you like, and came to Interac and said, "Why don't you use our application? We'll help you." And that way, we're saving money for the banks, we're reducing impacts to merchants, and we're getting better foothold for chip cards in Canada, which is good for Canadians. And it was actually at that moment, and several years after that, that on the one hand, sure, we fought viciously for every debit transaction and for our share of the piece of plastic that the bank issues on debit. But ultimately, we Interac and Visa collaborated in a fantastic way around delivering chip cards to Canada. And it ultimately ended up also being a partnership with MasterCard and American Express to make sure that every Canadian understood that they could trust their payment card again. So to me, that was a game changing moment. I never understood uh, the animosity that some people who worked at Visa or MasterCard felt for the fierce competition that is an experience in other markets, beating each other to win bank X or bank Y as an issuer, or getting an exclusive with a merchant so that you'd have a better offering at the point of sale for that merchant. Like, sure, that stuff happens, but at the end of the day, making payments safe and making sure they work, that's the common space. It might sound Pollyanna here, but it's actually what happens.
Great.
And it's the same in the e-commerce space, right? Like, how do we make sure we're building authentication solutions that make sure people are confident in spending? Or Visa Direct and MasterCard Sound, so direct from account push payments. How do we make sure they're interoperable so that the payment will actually land? Those 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 collaborations are not putting the brand first, they're putting Canadians first. And
Right.
those are the things that I actually always felt pretty good about and kinda helped me stay in payments for a long time.
So I'm focusing a lot on payment systems. One of the reasons is that in our neck of the woods, we talk about payment systems as being a key part of boosting competition in the financial sector. It's not just going to help payment companies; it's going to help all sorts of financial services companies that move money in one way or another. At the end of the day, that said, there are a lot of levers you can pull outside the payment system to make financial services more competitive. So my question to you is: are payment systems overrated or underrated as tools to promote competition in financial services?
Well, let's first talk about what payment systems do. Because I often think of the payment systems as being kind of the dumb rail, right? It's the enabler of data and communication between financial institutions that helps facilitate the money movement. Um, sure, there are rules around how those transactions need to traverse, and some of those rules limit who gets to do them. Um, and there's a whole history there of, um, you know, varying levels of rigidity around who gets to participate in various payment systems. And I I will strongly concur with you that some of those restrictions and limitations have limited innovation and competition in Canada. I don't think that's a controversial statement. Um, where like to think of the innovation and competition is, and this is where I think one of the greatest things that's happened in the last 15 years is that we've stopped thinking about things in vertical silos, that you must do A and B and C and D and E, and each only one institution needs to do all of those pieces. Instead, what we're seeing is that fragmentation. That, for example, in my space, the role of Central One is we're the network access point for Interac and for Payments Canada. Innovation and interesting new payment types and great customer experiences, they happen at the credit union level or whoever our customer is. And so what we are is we call ourselves the best vanilla ice cream out there because what we do is just one thing. We connect well to networks and we make sure payments flow. And the innovation or the great experiences around a real-time rail payment or an e-transfer or um, a payroll payment, those largely come from other services we provide or things that the customer, the credit union or otherwise do. And so in a lot of ways, I think the more we separate the vanilla ice cream, the rail enablement, and focus on being really good at that, it means we'll get the reliability and safety and security that we need. And then the innovation should happen on top. And so that's our model. We don't chase fancy. We quote unquote stick to our knitting, and we're really proud of it because being good at Rails is really hard.
Yeah. Now I want some vanilla ice cream. Since you mentioned it, I want to dig into this because I don't think many people have an appreciation for it. Let's take a step back. What is a central, and why is it even a thing?
Okay. So centrals were created by regulators because they wanted to see a pooling of resources. So in the credit union space, you'll know there are several hundred credit unions in Canada. Some of them are tiny, and some of them are quite large. And by pooling assets and resources and building common utility functions, it's far more efficient. And so we talk about we talk in Canada, for example, e-transfer. E-transfer is the envy of the world because we have ubiquity. So the smallest credit union and the largest financial institution can exchange payments with each other, and you can reliably count on everybody having access to be able to facilitate those payments in the regulated FI space, right? And so that's the model. Well, the centrals are responsible for bringing tens or hundreds of financial institutions along and enabling them so that we can achieve ubiquity. And so that's our job. And so the centrals, we perform functions around clearing and settlement for all of our downstream customers. And we provide connectivity and processing and operational support because it's the only efficient way to do it when you've got lots of smaller players. So that's what the central is for. We also pool capital so that we help de-risk the whole system. So we as the credit union system have a system of cross guarantees so that we protect each other. And then in turn, we provide a level of certainty so that the Royal Banks and the TDs and the CIBCs who are big have confidence that we've got systems in place to make sure that if we have one financial institution in trouble somewhere, it's okay. We've got a system in place that helps protect the
Right.
rest of the ecosystem in case there's somebody in trouble. So
Right.
that's why they exist, and we still today, there's geographic centrals for each of the provinces. The Atlantic is pooled into one central, and we support each other because we're all like Desjardins, we've all grown up in a system of cooperation that we support each other, we provide services. I clear and settle all Atlantic Central transactions. We work together with each other and we look to pool assets so that we are competitive and provide a banking choice for Canadians. We really think it's important that the flavor of banking we offer, which is different than a big bank, we think it's important that we maintain that as a choice for Canadians. And the best way to do that is to be in a group structure.
Right. Uh, when it comes to the shared infrastructure
Mhm.
on this efficiency curve, presumably at some point there are decreasing returns to scale, and maybe even at some point they become negative because the more and you tell me if I'm wrong, the more participants or shareholders, the harder it is for the company to generate the consensus needed to change and update and stay innovative. So one, I guess, is that trade-off real?
So let's not mix. So asset pooling and aggregation of a service model is one thing. The governance framework of that doesn't mean that every single voice has the same authority. And we, like everybody else, has a board of directors who that represents the diversity of our type of client. Um, and so it's designed like any other board to drive some efficiencies in delivering multiple perspectives about how a company should be run. So we're like anybody else on that front. Um, where it gets challenging is when you have a couple hundred customers at very different levels of sophistication, geographic differences, different kinds of customer. That we we have come together to celebrate that diversity. It's what makes credit unions cool, but it's also what makes us a rowdy bunch sometimes to corral. We don't face that very much in the payment space because our job is what we've defined it to be. We are a utility player that delivers great vanilla ice cream. That's a pretty uncontroversial thing. And as payments has gotten increasingly complex and expensive, there's a lot of consensus. Make them do it so we don't have to, is
Right.
pretty much what our clients say.
Right.
And it's also requiring a level of expertise that you're not going to get across a couple hundred credit unions. And so it becomes governance on the payment side is not a difficult thing as long as we're meeting our customers who are the credit unions and other clients. As long as we're meeting their needs and listening to them, we're like any other organization.
Right. Why isn't there only one central for all of Canada and instead a small handful?
Again, we go back to our roots. We're trying to respect geographic differences and history and how the system evolved. Um, but we have each of the prairies has a central, BC and Ontario merged. And then Atlantic has a central that is, and each of the Atlantic provinces is part of that one. And then we come together as a group. And Central One is the manager of the group clearer, who is essentially the clearinghouse for all of the other centrals. And so we achieve all the efficiencies. We achieve efficiencies within Payments Canada and with the other FIs because we manage the position of all the other centrals who sit behind us as their manager. And then we have a joint governance structure between the centrals. We got lots of governance to help us work together as a unit. But, that this is a scale business and we look for ways to manage efficiently, particularly to make sure that we're bringing efficiency and scale to all these small players so that we are able to go toe to toe with Royal Bank if there's a disputed transaction on behalf of anybody in our and I don't mean to
Right.
pick on Royal Bank here, but I mean just as an example, anybody of our individual credit unions, they need our help to engage the other financial institutions to make sure payments are working.
Right. I have heard, and I can't recall the specifics now, some some variant of a joke that goes something to the effect of, the cooperative sector is not very cooperative. Does that ring true to you or no? It's just a nice joke we like to tell ourselves at conferences to lighten the mood.
Um, so I have not heard that expression. What what I would say is um, the
I mean, you
cooperative.
you called them a rowdy bunch, so like maybe you're getting at like some
Oh,
healthy
that
tensions between all the different parties.
so I'm not sure it's tensions, it's differences,
Yeah.
and the the one of the most refreshing things about being in the cooperative sector is we relish our differences. It's celebrated. Um, you know, the innovative financing and payment stuff that you can see from a credit union that serves agriculture in the London, Ontario area, or that serves fishermen in Newfoundland, um, and small businesses in British Columbia. Like the they have built solutions to meet their customers' needs, and they know who their customers are in a way that I don't think a big bank understands. So that's what drives us, and that's our commonality. But so if you like, the cooperative movement is about celebrating the diversity. And so, yeah, sometimes we're a really rowdy bunch because we look at the world differently and we're serving different customers. But at the end of the day, on the things that matter, we come together, and that's like vanilla ice cream.
Yes.
How do you dispute vanilla, right? Everybody likes vanilla. So we come together on the critical stuff, and we celebrate differences as much as we can, because that's what we're supposed to do. That's
Right.
where we fit in our Canadian ecosystem.
Are any of the differences irreconcilable? Suppose some of those between the largest credit unions in Canada and maybe some of the smaller ones.
I think uh, we're at an economic time where all financial institutions are looking at their balance sheets and figuring out the trajectory of their future. Um, and I imagine that if you asked if um, EQ Bank and Royal Bank of Canada were entirely aligned on what they needed to do, that you'd probably see some pretty key differences. The same would be true in our community, small, medium, large. They've all got different business objectives and business plans, and so they're not the same. But that's okay, right? And that's why we land on things like vanilla instead of, if we started to layer on chocolate sprinkles, chocolate sauce, whipped cream, and so on, we might be stepping into an area where some credit unions say, oh, that's my space. I have a business plan to pursue doing some of those value added capabilities. And smaller ones might say, no, please, Central One, do it all for me. Right. And so the secret sauce for us as a aggregator of services to a diverse clientele is to find that right place to play. And
Right.
so that's that's probably why you hear cooperative question mark from time to time, is because it's a super dynamic
Right.
environment.
It's occurred to me just now, and it should have occurred to me much earlier, that for possibly the bulk of your career, you've been at places that have had to broker all types of consensus between so many conflicting stakeholders at Central One, at the payment systems. You started your career in government, which also does that, perhaps on steroids. You started at the Department of Finance, if I recall correctly. Can you tell us about that?
So that's how I got into payments. Um, was All these letters started hitting the Minister of Finance's desk, and it what related to some disputes um, about pre-authorized payments and about consumer rights and merchant rights. And it really shone a light on um, how payments is a multi-stakeholder environment, and where you've always got to seek. There's never going to be consensus. Like in the four-party model of credit card, there's no consensus. You're trying to find balance. And so uh, what was so funny is at the Department of Finance, payments was not a file. It wasn't a big file, but it happened to be part of what I did at the time. And it all of a sudden was hitting the minister's desk with all these irate letters from consumers about wanting to stop gym memberships, for example, payments and things of that nature, and finding that they didn't have the rights that they needed. And so we had to navigate through something that a minister of finance is inherently allergic to because it's deep and complex. And they don't have the bandwidth and capacity to go deep on a payments file one day and then solve for inflation and, economic policy models the next. So I got into the payments space when I was working in financial sector policy with the department, and it led to us looking at CPA rules and how this entity that was run by the banks was making rules that had an impact on the entire ecosystem. And so you're right. The reason I've been in payments for 30 years is because inherently payments is about two really important things. It's the most important thing to most of us because it's our money, and it's about multi-stakeholder management because there are so many players that need to make it work. and finding that balance. And so you're right. I didn't seek out ever to work in a bank because that's it's not as dynamic and interesting and complex as the network environments where you need to set the rules of engagement and the frameworks to help us find balance so that consumers get the value that they want, merchants see the value they want, innovation occurs on the edges, the right rules are in place so people have the rights they need if there's something going wrong with their money. So to me, the more interesting space in payments has been in that multi-stakeholder engagement. So after Interac and Visa and Payments Canada, the obvious place for me to go was to the credit union system where there's a couple hundred of them who are all saying different things at different times, and you got to find that middle ground. So you're right.
Right.
It's what's kept payments interesting for me for 30 years is that.
Back then, when we were talking about the pad rules and how well or not well consumers were protected in a range of scenarios, did the big picture issue of payment system governance come up, or was that not something thought about until much later, which we know it was eventually thought of, but just because noise was made around that later on doesn't mean it wasn't, talk,
No.
talked about maybe a decade before.
So in the early 90s, when this file was hitting my desk in the Department of Finance, we had to create something called the Stakeholder Advisory Council because we recognized, the Department of Finance recognized there weren't enough voices of users, that it was too much about making sure the rules were there to protect the users, direct users, the FIs. And
Right.
so that gave birth to SAC, which today I still think is a model for, at least conceptually, it's a model for how we need to engage all of the stakeholders in the conversation about where we take our infrastructure. So yes, ever since I've been in payments, the question of how users of the system get to influence the direction of the system has been on the table and will probably never land on perfect.
So, I mean, your last sentence there makes me not want to ask this next question because I feel like that answers it. Let me think of a different way to put it. In the 90s, you talked about governance. You created the Stakeholder Advisory Council. Governance became an issue a little later on. The Board of Payments Canada was made majority independent. Still, there are suggestions that Payments Canada is not as inclusive as it ought to be. Its membership is too restrictive. There are new players in the space. We need to get them in there, not only to be able to access the systems, but also lend their voice
Mhm.
to the debate, because there is a perception, at the very least, that the Stakeholder Advisory Council, as it's used today, it's kind of for show. It's not really like this thing that really drives the strategic decision making at Payments Canada. It's more of like and you don't have to agree with me. I'm just putting it out there as the perception that I hear, which leads me to believe that we've been trying to solve a governance problem for the past 30 years, and we really haven't. We keep trying to do new things. Um, uh, how would you assess or rate the efficacy of public policy intervention here to achieve whatever goal the government's been trying to achieve with payment system oversight?
That's a big question. And I don't agree with you on SAC. Um, and the reason why is because one of my jobs at Payments Canada was to manage the the two advisory councils.
It went
And
downhill after you left, Sue.
okay, that's why. Um, uh, here's the problem that I saw at the time. It was um, the business of Mac is very much the business of the guts of how things work and risk management frameworks and liability issues and consumer complaints to the financial institution and the actual plumbing of interconnectedness. So for every 1 hour of public policy conversation, there's probably 100 of plumbing, if you like. Um, and that always disproportionately takes attention of executives because you got to make sure things are going to work. And so, particularly in a period of modernization, it might feel like, oh, the FIs are over there in the corner designing and building stuff, and we don't have a voice. And I'm sure it feels like that as a stakeholder because you're only in one meeting out of every 100, say. Um, the flip side of that is when I look at other countries around the world, they don't have SAC. Typically, the Payments Canada infrastructure is run in a central bank. And that's a proxy for public policy. And, the best thing and the hardest thing about Payments Canada is that it is not part of a central bank, that it is funded by the financial institutions, which also not just rules and plumbing that matter, it's also how much this is all going to cost. Because not only do the FIs need to pay for their own infrastructure change, they got to pay for Payments Canada's change. That occupies a good few hours a month. Um, but so the fact that the users and participants have a voice in the direction is wonderful. Has Payments Canada got that balance between stakeholder and financial institution user yet? I am very encouraged by the conversations about access. I am very encouraged by the strong, consistent messaging since 2015 from the Department of Finance that they want to make sure it delivers innovation and competition. And for those of us who are small financial institutions, we also point to those words from time to time to remind everybody that the public policy objectives we're trying to achieve is innovation and competition, regardless of who's delivering it. Right? So are we there yet? No. Does it feel like we're there yet? No. And part of that, I genuinely believe, because I sit through all those meetings, is the 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 financial institution role right now is heavy on build, on fund, and on execution to make sure it's going to work. If I were running the stakeholder advisory council today, um, I would be continuing to be at that table and continuing to look for ways to find opportunities to insert myself around the user experience, around the participation models, around innovation areas where those are threatened. And I think our current SAC is doing that really nicely. And we have a lot more joint MAC and SAC together than we ever had a few years ago. So I'm somewhat optimistic that as we get out of execution mode and into run mode, that there's going to be even more opportunity for us to find a better balance between the users of the system and the deliverers, and that some of those people who are just users today will become part of the builders and executors tomorrow.
Right. Do you think the delivery of this thing would have been a lot more effective and a lot more economical had the governance of this thing been radically different? Had the governance of this thing been entrusted to our central bank, who in this hypothetical world could have just come and said, look, we're going to build this system. It needs to be done. FIs, you need to plug in. You can't say no. This is the launch date. See you then.
I think other examples around the world suggest that there are more efficient ways to do this. I can also say that the unity and the drive to get to an RTR now that we've landed in a consensus model to get something out there and get there, we're going to have something pretty special that will have usage. And I question whether all those other models that are imposed by central bankers and built, whether they have achieved as much as we might achieve when we finally get to go live.
Right. Some people have said we're building railroads when everyone else is building airplanes. So some people think the future isn't going to be about these payment system operators, these traditional clearing houses. It's all stable coin arrangements, distributed ledgers. Is this a reasonable, however unlikely, hypothesis for what the future may hold? Or do you think it's just too far out there to be taken seriously at this point?
I remember in 2017 and 2018 talking about links and real-time rail and out talking to the industry, and everybody said, isn't this ridiculous? Shouldn't we just all move to blockchain? So there's always going to be something shiny and new out there. But I go right back to my comments from the beginning. Payments is about choice. And just because you give me an alternative to a check, sadly in Canada, we know people are sticking to their checks. And so change in payments is slow and painful. There may be paradigm shifts coming. I do think there are interesting opportunities around stablecoin. And I do think we can move away from the extraordinarily tech-intensive and expensive rail systems that we have today. But I think it's going to take a lot of time. And some of the payments we use today, we love them. And you're not taking away my debit card. Even when I'm presented with 100 choices about how to do direct from account payment, my debit card will still be there. So,
Right.
We'll evolve, but I don't see sea change that completely, we said the same thing about Bitcoin too, right? Like, oh my God, the world's going to completely change. It's going to take time.
What's the biggest problem in payments right now that no one's paying attention to?
Well, fraud and cyber. I think people are paying attention to it. I don't know if we're paying enough attention to it. If we undermine people's confidence in how they move their money, we got a bigger problem. But the pace of innovation in fraud and cyber attacks is alarming. And I don't think even if we paid all our attention to it, it wouldn't be enough. So
on that happy note, I'm going to go get some vanilla ice cream. Sue, thank you so much for joining us today. And that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for joining us. If you're looking for more, visit us at fintechscanada.ca or follow us on LinkedIn. See you next time.